There are moments in history when the official version feels incomplete, when the facts presented to the public seem too clean, too convenient, and far too quiet for the magnitude of what truly happened. This is one of those stories, a story that begins after the war was already over, after the celebrations had ended, and after one of the most controversial and brilliant generals in American history was suddenly gone. What you are about to hear is not speculation for entertainment. It is a real historical account, built on documents, testimonies, and a confession that came only after silence was no longer useful. Before we go any further, leave a comment telling where you are watching from and whether you believe the truth about history is often hidden. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and join the discussion, because what comes next challenges everything most people think they know. George S. Patton was not a man who faded quietly. He was loud, aggressive, uncompromising, and terrifyingly effective on the battlefield. He was also deeply inconvenient to powerful people. By the time the Second World War ended, Patton had become a liability not because he failed, but because he spoke too freely. He criticized political decisions, questioned alliances, and openly challenged the future plans of the post-war world. In private conversations, he warned that the next great conflict was already being prepared, and that former enemies were being repositioned as allies. Officially, Patton died from injuries sustained in a simple automobile accident in December 1945, just months after the war ended. A slow-moving military truck collided with his car in Germany. Everyone else survived. Patton did not. The explanation was neat, tragic, and quickly accepted. A freak accident, nothing more. But even at the time, something felt wrong. Patton was a man who survived relentless combat, artillery fire, ambushes, and near-death experiences across multiple campaigns. Yet a minor collision at low speed left him paralyzed, then dead days later. The driver survived. The truck driver survived. No gunfire, no explosion, just Patton gone. Dwight D. Eisenhower attended Patton's funeral. Publicly, he honored him as a war hero. Privately, witnesses would later describe Eisenhower as deeply conflicted. Their relationship had been complicated, marked by respect, rivalry, and growing ideological distance. What Eisenhower knew, what he suspected, and what he eventually admitted would not come out immediately. It would take years, the end of careers, and the safety of distance from power. After the funeral ended, the story was supposed to be over, but it was only beginning. In the months that followed, inconsistencies emerged. Reports were altered, testimonies changed, critical medical details were quietly ignored. Doctors later questioned how Patton's injuries progressed so rapidly. Intelligence officers noticed that certain files related to the incident were classified without clear reason. And perhaps most disturbing of all, Patton himself had expressed fear shortly before the accident, telling close associates that he believed he would not be allowed to return home. He had enemies, not only among foreign powers, but within the very system he served. Years later, when Eisenhower was no longer constrained by the pressures of wartime alliances and political survival, he reportedly acknowledged something he never dared say publicly while in power. Not a direct accusation, but an admission heavy with implication, an acknowledgement that Patton's death was not as simple as the public had been told, that powerful interests wanted him silent, that his continued presence threatened carefully constructed plans for the future of global power. Eisenhower did not name names. He did not reopen investigations, but what he admitted changed how historians would later view that cold December morning in Germany. It reframed the accident not as chance, but as opportunity. And as more information surfaced over the decades, a chilling possibility became impossible to ignore, that Patton's death was not an accident at all, but a controlled removal disguised as misfortune. Because in the world Patton warned about, truth was dangerous, and silence was necessary. And just as the public accepted the official explanation and moved on, the real story continued to unfold quietly, hidden in archives, whispered in memoirs, and buried beneath the weight of geopolitics that reshaped the post-war world in ways Patton openly opposed. Reshaped the post-war world in ways Patton openly opposed. And it is precisely there, in that uncomfortable opposition, that the deeper meaning of his death begins to take form. Patton believed the war had ended too early, and in the wrong way. He argued that the Soviet Union, not Germany, would become the next great threat. This belief was not casual conversation. He spoke about it repeatedly, to officers, to journalists, and even within military circles that were already shifting toward a new geopolitical strategy. His words clashed directly with the emerging post-war consensus. While leaders were focused on rebuilding Europe and maintaining fragile alliances, Patton was talking about confrontation, betrayal, and the cost of ignoring reality. To many, he sounded dangerous, uncontrolled, impossible to manage. Documents from that period reveal growing concern about Patton's behavior. He refused to soften his language. He rejected scripted public statements. He continued to speak as a soldier, not as a politician. Behind closed doors, officials debated what to do with him. Removing him from command was not enough. Sending him home risked something worse, a national hero speaking freely to the American public. Shortly before the accident, Patton was scheduled to return to the United States. Friends noticed a shift in his tone. He was restless, frustrated, and increasingly outspoken. He confided that he felt trapped, surrounded by people who no longer trusted him. According to one close associate, Patton said he felt like a man who had outlived his usefulness. Then came the accident. The details, when examined closely, raise unsettling questions. The road was clear. Visibility was good. The vehicles were moving slowly. The impact itself was not severe enough to explain the outcome. Other passengers suffered only minor injuries. Yet Patton alone sustained catastrophic damage to his neck. Even more troubling was what followed. Medical care was delayed. Specialists were not immediately called. His condition worsened rapidly, despite earlier assessments suggesting he would recover. And then there is the matter of the silence. News of Patton's death spread quickly, but investigation did not follow. No serious inquiry, no independent review. The incident was categorized, filed, and closed. For a man of his stature, this lack of scrutiny was extraordinary. Soldiers noticed, officers noticed, intelligence professionals noticed. But questioning the narrative carried consequences, and few were willing to risk them. Years later, when Eisenhower was reflecting on the war and its aftermath, he spoke privately to historians and confidants about Patton. He described him as a man who saw the world too clearly, too early. Eisenhower admitted that Patton's views had made him dangerous, not to enemies, but to allies. And while Eisenhower never publicly accused anyone, he conceded that Patton's death conveniently resolved a problem that leadership did not know how to handle. This was not a confession in the traditional sense. It was something more subtle and perhaps more revealing. An admission that the official explanation served a purpose, that asking too many questions would have destabilized fragile power structures at a critical moment in history. As decades passed, additional testimonies surfaced. Intelligence operatives hinted at covert discussions. Military insiders referenced classified concerns. Even Patton's own family expressed doubt that the full truth had ever been told. Each piece alone could be dismissed. Together, they formed a pattern that could not be easily ignored. A pattern suggesting that Patton was not simply a victim of bad luck, but of timing. That his death aligned too perfectly with political necessity. That once the funeral ended, the real decisions had already been made. And if that is true, then the question is no longer whether Eisenhower knew something was wrong, but how much he understood and how far he was willing to go to protect a narrative that kept the world from unraveling at the dawn of a new and uncertain era, Because once the emotional weight of Patton's funeral faded, what remained was a silence that spoke louder than any official statement. Behind that silence were people who knew how power truly worked. They understood that history is not only written by victors, but carefully edited by survivors. Patton did not survive, and that made controlling his legacy far easier. His warnings could be reframed as eccentricity. His criticism could be labeled recklessness. His absence removed the need for confrontation. What troubled later historians was not only what Eisenhower hinted at, but what he never denied. When asked directly whether Patton's death raised suspicions, Eisenhower did not dismiss the question. He avoided it. To those who studied his words closely, that avoidance mattered. Eisenhower was a man known for precision in language. When he chose not to deny something, it was often because denial would have been dishonest. There were also intelligence reports that never reached the public, files that remained sealed long after similar documents were released, references to internal disagreements about Patton's future role, notes suggesting concern about how much influence he still held over troops and civilians alike. One memo described Patton as strategically unpredictable, a phrase rarely used for enemies. and almost never for decorated heroes. Even more unsettling were the accounts surrounding Patton's final days. Visitors recalled that he seemed lucid, alert, and aware that something was wrong beyond his physical condition. He spoke about unfinished business, about being prevented from telling the truth. To one officer, he reportedly said that the war's real consequences had not yet begun, and that people would soon realize who the true winners were. Then came his sudden decline. Official reports attributed his death to complications, but the timeline raised questions. His paralysis remained stable, then worsened unexpectedly. No clear infection was documented. No catastrophic internal failure explained the speed of his deterioration. And yet, no autopsy was performed. For a figure of his importance, this omission was extraordinary. Years later, intelligence operatives who had served in Europe hinted that Patton had been marked as a liability long before the accident. Not for what he had done, but for what he might do next. He was a man who refused to accept the emerging narrative of peace. He believed the conflict had merely shifted form, and he was willing to say that publicly. That willingness made him dangerous. Eisenhower, by contrast, believed stability required compromise. He understood that revealing internal fractures could lead to chaos. If Patton had lived, the post-war story would not have been simple. There would have been questions the public was not ready to ask, alliances that could not withstand scrutiny, decisions that would have appeared immoral so soon after victory. And so, whether by action or by acceptance, Patton was removed from the equation. This does not mean Eisenhower ordered anything. History offers no proof of that. What it suggests instead is something more complex and more human. That Eisenhower understood what had happened, understood why it had happened, and chose silence as the lesser of two evils. A decision that protected institutions, even as it buried the truth. As time passed, Eisenhower carried that weight quietly. In later years, he warned against unseen forces shaping national decisions. He spoke about power operating beyond public awareness. To some, these warnings felt abstract. To others, they sounded like regret. And when historians placed Patton's death within that broader context, a chilling interpretation emerged, that the accident was not random, that the aftermath was not mishandled by chance, and that the greatest admission Eisenhower ever made was not spoken aloud, but implied through what he allowed to remain unanswered, because once the funeral ended, the world moved on. But the consequences of that silence echoed forward, shaping a future Patton had tried desperately to warn about. And the more historians examined the years that followed, the more Patton's absence felt intentional rather than coincidental. The post-war world unfolded almost exactly as Patton had feared. Former enemies were rehabilitated. Former allies became rivals. Lines were redrawn, not based on morality, but on convenience. The public was told this was necessary for peace. Behind closed doors, it was understood as a strategic gamble. Patton would have challenged it relentlessly. He would have spoken plainly, without diplomatic language, without restraint. That alone explains why his survival posed a problem. Several researchers later focused on one disturbing detail that had long been overlooked: Patton's security. In the final weeks of his life, his movements were unusually unrestricted. Protective measures were relaxed. Routes were changed with minimal oversight. For a general of his rank, this was highly irregular. At the time, it was explained as routine. In hindsight, it looked more like negligence by design. There were also inconsistencies in witness statements from the accident scene. Initial accounts described confusion and shock. Later versions became polished, simplified, and aligned. Small contradictions disappeared. Critical questions were never asked again. The narrative hardened quickly, as if urgency demanded closure. Eisenhower, now stepping into a broader leadership role, understood something most did not: that reopening Patton's case would have meant reopening the war itself. It would have forced the public to confront uncomfortable truths about alliances, compromises, and the moral cost of victory. It would have undermined trust at a moment when unity was essential, and so the silence held. Privately, Eisenhower acknowledged Patton's brilliance. He also acknowledged his danger. In conversations later documented by historians, Eisenhower referred to Patton as a man who could not exist in the world that was being built, not because he was wrong, but because he refused to adapt to political reality. That single sentence revealed more than any official statement ever could. Patton did not fit the future, and the future did not allow obstacles. As years passed, Those who had served alongside Patton began to speak more openly. Some admitted they never believed the accident story. Others said they were warned to let it go. A few claimed that questioning the narrative could end careers. These were not fringe voices. They were respected officers, men who understood both war and bureaucracy. The idea that Patton's death was orchestrated did not require a vast conspiracy. It required only opportunity, motive, and silence. Opportunity existed in the chaos of post-war Europe. Motive existed in Patton's refusal to comply. Silence existed because too many people benefited from his absence. Eisenhower's role remains the most complex. He was neither villain nor hero in this story. He was a man balancing truth against stability. And in that balance, truth lost. His later warnings about hidden power structures, about forces operating beyond public accountability, sound different when viewed through this lens. They no longer feel abstract. They feel personal, as if he was cautioning future generations about the cost of silence, even when silence feels necessary. Patton's death closed one chapter, but it opened another. A chapter defined not by what was said, but by what was deliberately left unsaid. And as more documents were declassified, as more voices emerged from the shadows of history, the question became unavoidable. If Patton had lived, how different would the world have been? And more importantly, once Eisenhower finally admitted to himself what had truly happened, did he realize that the decision to remain silent would shape the very future he worked so hard to protect? Because in the end, history does not judge silence kindly, even when it is chosen for reasons that seem justified at the time. Patton's death became a footnote in the grand narrative of victory, but its implications stretched far beyond that winter in Germany. As the Cold War emerged, many began to notice how accurately Patton had predicted the shift in global power. The tensions he warned about hardened into doctrine, the rivalries he spoke of became permanent, and the uneasy alliances he criticized revealed their fragility again and again over the following decades. With each confirmation of Patton's foresight, the questions surrounding his death grew louder. Eisenhower, by then a former president, reflected often on leadership and responsibility. In private moments, he spoke about decisions that could never be undone, about truths that arrived too early to be safely spoken. Those close to him later suggested that Patton weighed heavily on his conscience. Not because Eisenhower had ordered his removal, but because he had understood what others were willing to do and chose not to stop it. That choice changed everything. By allowing the official story to stand, Eisenhower preserved stability, but at the cost of transparency. He ensured a smooth transition into the post-war order, but sacrificed a man who refused to accept a carefully managed reality. Patton was inconvenient precisely because he was honest. He spoke without calculation. And in a world shifting from open warfare to strategic manipulation, that kind of honesty was no longer tolerated. The truth about Patton's death may never be fully proven. Some documents remain classified. Some witnesses carried their secrets to the grave. But history does not rely solely on proof. It also relies on patterns, on motive, and on the uncomfortable alignment of events that refuse to be dismissed as coincidence. When Eisenhower finally admitted, even indirectly, that Patton's death was not simply an accident, he did not rewrite history. He exposed its fragility. He revealed how easily narratives can be shaped and how dangerous inconvenient voices can become when they threaten powerful interests. Patton wanted to come home. He wanted to speak. He wanted to warn. He never got the chance. And perhaps that is the most telling detail of all. Not how he died, but when. At a moment when the world was deciding what kind of future it wanted. A future built on compromise, secrecy, and controlled truths. Patton belonged to a different kind of war, one where enemies were clear and words were weapons. Once that world ended, there was no place for him in the new one. Today, revisiting Patton's death is not about assigning blame. It is about understanding how power operates when history is being written in real time. It is about recognizing that some truths are buried, not because they are false, but because they are too disruptive to be allowed into the light. And it is about remembering that even the most celebrated victories can carry shadows, long and quiet, stretching far beyond the sound of gunfire and the closing notes of a funeral. If this story made you question what you thought you knew, leave a comment and share your perspective. History only remains alive when it is examined, challenged, and remembered beyond the version we are first told. Because sometimes, the most important admissions are not spoken loudly, but revealed slowly, long after the world has moved on.